Hello all, welcome to this new lesson. And in this lesson, I'm going to teach you how to use Scanf function to take user inputs to your program through the keyboard during runtime. Okay, so let's get started. So what is Scanf function? Scanf is a standard C library function that is used to take user inputs through the keyboard during runtime. Okay, and the Scanf function will take this form as shown on the screen. So as arguments to Scanf function, it will have two main parts. One is the string of format specifiers and the other is address of variables separated by commas. So the first part, that is the string of format specifiers, will indicate to the scanf as to what type of data has to be taken as input through the keyboard. And the second part, that is address of variables separated by commas, will indicate the location as to where the values has to be stored once it has been taken as input through the keyboard. Okay, so to understand scanf better, let us work on few examples. Okay, only then you will be able to understand the actual working of scanf better. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, I've given you four different examples of the usage of Scanf. Okay, so let us discuss each one by one, right? So the first Scanf says that it will take an integer input and only one integer input. And once it takes that integer input, it will store that value into the address of the variable A. Okay, so we know that the format specifier corresponding to an integer data type is %d, and therefore this %d will indicate the type of data that the user is keying in onto the keyboard, right? So this scanf will take a single integer input and store it in the address of the variable A. Okay, now what if I want to take two user inputs? Okay, I want to enter two user inputs and both the inputs are integer values and I want to store it into two different variables, right? In that case, I will have to use a scanf in this form. Okay, so as part of your double quotes, we will have to write the corresponding format specifiers for each inputs because I want to take two integer values. So therefore, I will write %d twice. Okay, each one corresponding to each of the input, and the other part of your scanf says where those values has to be stored, right? So the first integer value would be stored in the address of the variable A, and the second integer value would be stored in the address of variable B. Okay, now what if I want to take two user inputs where one input is of type integer and the other input is of type floating point type. Okay, in that case, as part of the string, we will have to write the corresponding format specifiers. So as you can see, the first input is %d, which is nothing but an integer, and the second input is a format specifier %f corresponding to the floating point data type. Okay, so this scanf, after taking two inputs, okay, the first input would be stored in the address of the variable A and the second input would be stored in the address of variable B. Okay, now similarly, if suppose I want to take three user inputs where the first two inputs would be an integer type of value and the third input would be a floating point type of value. In that case, we will have to write the corresponding format specifiers over here, okay, as part of the string. So as you can see, as part of the string, I've given three format specifier. The first two corresponding to the first two integers, okay, and the last one corresponding to the third floating point value that I will be taking as input. Okay, so after taking the first integer input, I will store it in the address of variable A. The second one would be stored in the address of variable B, and then the third floating point value would be stored in the address of variable C. Okay, so this is how your scanf function works. Okay, so as a quick repetition, scanf function is used to take user inputs through the keyboard during runtime, and as its input, you'll have to give two parts. One is a string which contains format specifiers corresponding to the input that you are taking through the keyboard, and the other part will contain the addresses of variables separated by commas, indicating the location as to where the taken values has to be stored. Okay, so this is how scanf function works. Okay, and scanf function is very useful to write generic code, right? So let me show you an example. Let me open my dev C++, right? So as you can see on my screen here, I've written a very simple C program to add two numbers. If you remember in one of the earlier lessons that we had written the same program to add two numbers, but there we had actually hard coded the values for num1 and num2. That is, we had written num1 is equal to 5, num2 is equal to 6. Okay, it means there was a hard coding of values into these variables. And in the previous lesson, I told you that hard coding of values is a bad programming practice. and as much as possible we have to make the code more generic, and that is the reason. Okay, so we are rewriting the previous code using scanf function. Okay, so as you can see that the first line is nothing but a declarative statement where I'm creating three variables, num1, num2 and sum, and then I have a printf function indicating to the user of this program as to what action he has to take. So I have just giving a nice diagnostic message which says enter two numbers to add, so that the programmer or the user knows what has to be done once he actually runs this program. Then we have a scanf function which is waiting for the user to give two inputs. Okay, so in my case I am taking two inputs, that is my program is taking two inputs. Okay, that is both are integer values, and once it receives the inputs from the user, okay, the first integer would be stored in the address of variable num1, and the second integer would be actually stored in the address of variable num2. Okay, so once scanf function will receive those values, okay, then this line will add those two values, and then the result would be stored in sum, and then the final printf will print the result on the screen. Okay, so this is the line that we have to concentrate in this lesson, where scanf function is waiting for the user to input two integer values, because the format specifier is %d and %d. Okay, so what we'll do now is we will try compiling and running this program and see whether it works correctly or not. Okay, so that you will understand how to work with scanf practically. Okay, now compile the program. So as you can see that there are no errors and warnings, so it means that the program is absolutely right. Now let me run this code and wait for the scanf to ask us for the input. Okay, the program is running. So now, as you can compare this with the code over here, the printf is saying enter two numbers to add. So this is the output of the printf. And now, as you can see, the cursor is blinking. It is nothing but the scanf is waiting for me to enter two integer values. Okay, so it is waiting for me to enter two integer values, and therefore let me give two values as 2, enter key 3. Okay, so once I enter 2 and 3 as input, okay, 2 will go and sit in the address of num1, and 3 will go and sit in address of num2. Okay, here num1 and num2, right? So later, so num1 will now contain 2 and num2 will contain 3, which will get added, and the result will get stored in the variable sum. Okay, so let's see that. And once that happens, so after the addition of these two numbers, the variable sum will contain the result, and that is getting printed, okay, on the screen using printf, that is sum is equal to whatever is the sum. So now if I enter, it should say sum is equal to 5. So therefore, after giving two inputs 2 and 3 to the scanf, okay, the printf function is now printing the output as sum is equal to 5. So therefore our program absolutely works fine. Okay, now let us work on one more example where I'll be modifying this program to add one integer and one floating point values. It means I will have to take one integer value and one floating point value through the scanf. Therefore, I will have to change this format specifier to %f, because the first one is an integer value and the second one corresponds to a floating point value. Okay, the first one would store after taking the first value, that would get stored in the address of the variable num1, and the second value would get stored in the address of the variable num2. But because we are taking a floating point value into the variable num2, so we will have to declare num2 to be a floating point value. So therefore, let me write it as float. Okay. And also we know that after adding an integer value and a floating point value, the result would also be a floating point. And therefore, I will have to also create or make sum as a floating point data type. Therefore, that is the reason I made sum and num2 both as floating point. Okay. Also, while printing the output, because we know that the sum will result in a floating point value, and that is the reason. I will say %f. Okay, in place of %d. Okay, so now let us compile and run this code to see if the program works fine. Okay, so let me first compile the program. So as you can see, there are no errors and warnings. Now I'm good to go to run this program. So it is now asking me to enter two numbers to add, right? So the scanf is waiting for me to give some input. So let me say 2 and 3.5. So because the second input must be a floating point value. And now as you can see, the result sum is equal to 5.5 followed by 5 zeros. Okay, so this is how you give input to your scanf function. Okay, so I hope you learned how scanf function works. So also hope you learned how to take user input through the keyboard using the scanf function. Okay, so in the upcoming lesson I will be writing, or I will also be teaching you how to write a simple C program to find the area of a circle, so that you will know how to make use of a scanf function to write generic code. Okay, so having said that, hope you enjoyed this lesson, and if you like this lesson, then don't forget to like this video. Also don't forget to click on the subscribe button and also on the bell icon, so that you don't miss out on any of my updates on this programming series. Okay, so having said that, meet you in the next lesson. Until then, take care. Bye bye. Love you all so much.